bow forward in prayer. God, today we're grateful that through the good days and the bad days, the ups and downs of life, we know that heaven is indeed looking down on us. Not just looking, not just observing, not just watching. Heaven is even concerned about us. It is involved in ensuring that we can endure and face the challenges of life in a way that glorifies the one who sits high and looks low. So we are grateful today. We pray now, God, that as your spirit is flowing through our worship experience today, that you would continue in this moment of proclamation to encourage us and empower us and speak to us afresh from your word. God, we pray today that you would punish not your people for the frailty of your preacher, that you would use me in spite of me, so people would be edified and that you, God, would get all of the glory. Challenge us, convict us, encourage us, and empower us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Look, my head a little hot, so I'm going to take my hat off. I'm going to sit right here. I'm still rocking with y'all, young people. Amen. Amen. We're excited today to jump into week 3 of this particular series that we're calling Gifted, wrapping what God has given us the first week. We talked about the fact that God has something for everyone, that God has gifted us all with something that we can bring to the table to contribute to the kingdom of God, to help in kingdom building, and that it's on us to find out what that is and then put it into action. Last week we talked about the notion that we are perfectly placed, that what God has given us and where we are in our stations and places of life, God has perfectly and sovereignly and providentially placed us there to have an impact and to use our gifts in a way that helps to build the kingdom and to make it better. Today, we want to shift a bit and look at, I was like, that's not the slide from for today. You with me? I see you. Thank you. Y'all give a shout out to our media ministry. Scare them for a second. They on it today. We want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We were in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 the last couple of weeks, but today we want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. And we want to invite you to stand as you locate it and mark it on your phone or in your on your tablet in your Bible. Invite you to stand and we'll read together from the screens that are before us. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. From New International Version, let us read together. Because of these surpassingly great revelations, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Amen. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Pray that the Lord will encourage us from this text and from the thought, the return policy. The return policy. There is perhaps no feeling that is more challenging to navigate than the transition from being excited about opening and receiving a beautifully wrapped or packaged gift, only to open it to discover that it is not something that you asked for or ever desired to have. Now, this is different, y'all, than the gift that is a size too small, or the gift that's not the right color. This gift is the one you are absolutely sure that you don't want. In fact, you probably said, I know I don't want that. Yet when you open your gift, that is what is there. You may have found yourself in a position of trying to figure out why the person who gave you the gift would think that it was a good idea for them to give you what they did. And it's awkward because oftentimes the gift giver is right there waiting on your reaction because they have assumed that they're out of the box. Let me try something different this year. Gift-giving tactics will be the thing that makes this Christmas holiday so memorable for you. But you open your gift and you are disappointed by what you have received. And that disappointment only grows as you realize that there is no gift receipt to go with the gift. But you smile, you accept the gift, and you ask the question, so where did you find this? And if you hear the name of the store, familiar retailer, in their response, your mind begins to strategize how you can use that store's return policy to turn a gift that you absolutely hate into something that you love. Most stores' return policies allow you to bring back an item purchased from them without a receipt. But you have to do it within a certain time frame, and often if you will receive store credit for the item that is returned instead of receiving funds back. But there are some stores that if you don't have proof of sale, then they won't accept the item, and you will be stuck with something that you never wanted. Then we hide that undesired gift in the back of the closet, the very top of the bookshelf, or some other nook and cranny we can find in the home, or maybe we put it in the pile for re-gifting to someone else. But every time we see it, we are reminded of that Christmas when we received that undesired gift. And I don't know about you this morning, but Christmas isn't the only time that we are given things that we didn't ask for and don't want. Life has a way of presenting to us circumstances, situations, people, and problems that are unwanted, unexpected, and unwelcome. Yet we are forced to face them each and every day. The doctor's cancer diagnosis wasn't welcome, particularly when she told us that it was late stage. The employer's decision to let you go was unexpected, particularly when they only gave you a week's notice in a lousy severance package. The marriage breakup was not expected, especially since everything seemed to be all good just a few weeks ago. Even for the most holy of us who look like they have it all together on the outside, we are wrestling with personal struggles of epic proportions on the inside. We don't want to deal with the low self-esteem, the depression, the anxiety, the frustrations, the negative self-talk, but every day we face the battle in our minds. And in all these circumstances, our prayer is, God, please take it away. We want to return the disease. We want to return the dysfunction. We want to return the disability. We want to return the depression. We desperately wish that there was a return policy where we could go and get some credit in the store of life. But we've got it now, and no matter how much we try to dress it up, hide it away, or keep it under wraps, it's a constant reminder of the low level of control that we have in our lives. This is where the Apostle Paul helps us today with his testimony in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He knows what it's like to deal with an issue that he can't escape the reality of and has to learn how to live with. In the first few verses of chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, Paul begins talking about his whole process of how he had this great spiritual experience and how this experience took him up into the third and fourth levels of heaven and glory. And then he comes to verse 7. He comes to verse 7 where he says, because of these surpassingly great revelations, God had to do something or allow something to happen in order to keep me from becoming conceited. And the text tells us that he was given a thorn in his flesh. This whole notion of a thorn is more than just a minor nuisance of an issue. This thorn was much more pronounced and brought a great deal of challenge to Paul as he was going about doing the work that God had called him to do. Not only does he call his issue a thorn in his flesh, but Paul calls it a messenger of Satan. Paul faced, y'all know messenger in the Greek is angelos, the same word we use for angel. And Paul was faced with an angel of Satan or a demon whose job was to torment him or literally punch him. Every time Paul thought life was going well, he felt his thorn. Every time Paul was beginning to feel himself a little bit and get a little too high on himself, the messenger of Satan would show up to knock him back down and remind him of his shortcomings. What's interesting in the text to note is that Paul never makes mention of the specific nature of his issue. Some folks would try to say that because it was a thorn in his flesh, that it was some kind of bodily ailment, or perhaps because there was some torment from a demon, that it was some kind of mental health issue. But Paul never says what the issue is. It could have been physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, or financial. And I'm glad that Paul never said what the issue was for our sake, because he doesn't tell us what a thorn is, because it's our invitation to look at ourselves and to figure out what our thorns are. And I don't know about you. I'm going to just talk about myself for a second. I don't know about you, but I know I've got some issues in my life that I just can't seem to solve. I've got some vices and some proclivities that I just can't seem to shake. And before you start judging the preacher this morning, before you start judging me, trying to figure out what I'm dealing with, I want to invite you to pull out your smartphone. Go to the camera, flip it to selfie mode so that you can start with the face that pops up right there. In fact, I need you to have that man in the mirror theology that says that Michael Jackson sang about, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. No message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change. Paul was worried about his thorn. And he says it was given to him. However, he never says who gave it to him. Now, we can read the text and assume that God gave it to him. But that may not be the case, because the truth is that there are some things that God sanctions, but God is not the source of. God will allow some things to happen in our lives, but God may not be the initiator of them. Like y'all know Job. Let me call my boy Job from the Old Testament. Job's story, in the first chapter of Job, there was a meeting between God and Satan in heaven. Satan shows up and says, listen, God, you got this great brother down here named Job that's doing everything, but I bet you if you let me touch him and take away the stuff that you blessed him with, that he will curse you. And God says, okay. You just can't kill him. God allowed Satan to put Job to the test. But God wasn't the source of the test that came his way. In fact, it was God who was the only reason that Job didn't die. Because God wouldn't allow it. And for somebody this morning, that ought to be a stop and shout moment. For somebody today, because the hell that you've been dealing with could be much worse, but God won't allow it. The attack of the enemy could be more intense in your life, but God won't allow it. Your self-sabotaging behavior should have had you in deeper and more dire circumstances, but God wouldn't allow it. The only thing keeping you from being completely consumed and completely overwhelmed is the fact that God is able to step in and draw some boundary lines on what can happen in our lives. When you think you have been through, when you think about all that you have been through and all that you are currently going through, it could have been much worse, but God won't allow it. There's some things that are just out of bounds. God may not have sent the trial, but even if he sanctioned it, God is ultimately in control of it. So Paul Doesn't say that God gave him the thorn, but Paul goes to God to deal with the issue. The text says that he asked God 3 times to take the thorn away. 3 times he prayed and pleaded with the Lord, said, take this away from me. But this 3 times in the text is a rhetorical euphemism that was used in Hebrew culture that was saying that Paul was continually praying about this issue. That means that Paul ain't just prayed 3 times about it, but that Paul was praying all the time about it. He was always in God's face. Listen, God, I'm talking to you again today. I need you to take this away from me. God, here I am. I know I talked about this yesterday, but I need you to get this thorn out of my flesh. God, I know we talked about this last week, but I'm here again asking you, take this away from me. And how many times have we prayed for God to take away the situation that we're facing, to take away the thing that's plaguing us, to get rid of that tormented demon that's bothering us in these moments? And we pray and it seems like God doesn't answer us. But if we check the text, we find out that God does have a response. Because look at how he responds to Paul. Verse 9, he says, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. God tells Paul, listen, I know you want to return to me what's been given to you, but I can't take it back. Because if I take it back, you won't have this reminder to make sure that you remember me. And I would then suggest that when we consider the thorns and the satanic messengers that show up in our lives, that sometimes the best thing for us is not to escape them, but to allow God to work through them to help us. I know that don't sound real good. That don't sound real comfortable. God is saying, no, I need you to keep that thing that you didn't want in the first place. Paul tells God that he wants God to take away the thorn, but God's response is not to allow him to escape the issue, but to give him the strength to handle and manage it. And when God strengthens us to endure, it's a sure sign that God's grace is at work. Y'all, we talked about God's grace a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the spiritual gifts that are at work as a sign of God's grace. But God's grace shows up not just in spiritual gifts, but also in the strength to keep going when we want to give up. The strength to keep getting up and facing each and every day with an issue that we didn't ask for, but we recognize God is working through it to make us better. God's return policy is that God may not take away every issue, but will use the issue as an expression of the power of God's grace in our lives. So then why is this expression of God's grace as God's return policy for the issue of our lives? Why is this so effective? First thing that I think the text shows us is that grace expresses God's approval of us. Grace expresses God's approval of us. In verse 9, God responds to Paul saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. The word sufficient is an adjective that means adequate or enough. Go back to English class for a second. Adjectives are words that are used to describe nouns. Sufficient is the word that's used to describe God's grace. That's something to celebrate and shout about. But what I noticed in the text is that there is no descriptive or qualifying word for the noun at the end of the sentence. My grace is sufficient for you. This leads me to believe that what God was communicating with Paul and is communicating to us is the fact that the condition of our existence doesn't preclude us from experiencing the sufficiency of God's grace. Let me say that a different way. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what you're facing, God's got enough grace for you and for what you're dealing with. To receive the grace of God is a sign that we have recognized our own shortcomings and insufficiencies. Listen, a big part of understanding how this grace piece works is recognizing that we can't do it all by ourselves on our own. We struggle with the fact that we don't have it all figured out. And oftentimes we can get ourselves in more trouble trying to figure it out on our own. Life can be like a complex maze sometimes, that every time we turn to the right or the left, more and more lost and can't figure out which way to go in order to get out of where we are. But if we can stop long enough in our journey of life to tell God that we don't have what it takes, that we don't know enough, that we're not smart enough, that we need a little bit of help to deal with the stuff that we're facing, that God's grace will be activated in our lives. Receiving the grace of God is a sign that God has favored us. That's what grace means, really. If we break down what God is saying in verse 9, God is saying, my grace, my favor is sufficient for you. My grace, my favor is for you. God has graced and favored you. God has given you something to lift you up. We know about the story of Mary and what the angel said to Mary as the angel Gabriel showed up to tell her the news about her carrying the Son of God in her womb. Said, blessed are you and highly favored among women. That same favor that Mary got is the favor that God has for us. That God was talking about in verse 9 when he says, my grace and my favor is sufficient for you. It's for you. It's not for perfect you. It's for you. It's not for got it all together you. It's for you. It's not for fried dye laid to the side, sharp and shine you, but it's for you. It's for broken you. It's for weak you. It's for can't get right you. It's for the you that you look at every day in the mirror before you put on your makeup, before you brush your hair and brush your teeth. It's for that you. God's grace is sufficient for you. But here's the reality, y'all. God can't give us grace until we're humble enough to admit that we need it. And that was Paul's issue. Paul had all of these great spiritual experiences that would cause him to be high and lifted up, to think of himself, as he wrote in Romans, more highly than he ought. But God said, you need this thorn. You need this issue to be reminded that you are limited. Yes, you are great over there, but you've fallen short over here. And that's the testimony of everybody's life in here. I know you think you're good, you think you're perfect, but at the end of the day, the testimony is you're great in some spots, but you're falling short in some other spots. But the good news is that God's got grace to fill in the gaps for the places where you fall short. God's grace is sufficient for you. Grace expresses God's approval of us, but also grace is always available for us. I like this one because we got to listen to how the text reads. It says, my grace is. We'll go back to English class again in a second. My grace is sufficient for you. Why do we emphasize that is in verse 9? My grace is, because is, y'all, is a verb. Is an action word. Is a word, and that word is in the present tense. Paul could have said that Paul could have said that God said my grace was sufficient for you. Paul could have wrote my grace will be sufficient for you. But the text says my grace is sufficient for you. I don't know about you, but that gets me excited because that lets me know that the grace that was sufficient for Paul over 2,000 years ago is sufficient for me today. And the grace that's sufficient for me today ain't just limited to me, but it flows to you. It's available to each and every one of us. It's good news because there is an unlimited supply of God's grace. Not only does it say that my grace is sufficient for you, but it also says my power is perfected in weakness. Now my power was perfected in weakness, or will be perfected in weakness, but my power is made perfect in weakness. So that means that in times when I find myself weak, the times when I feel like I can't go on any further, the times when I feel like I want to give up, throw in the towel, quit, run away, and go hide in my closet, God's got power power to strengthen me. That in fact his power operates best when I'm at my weakest point. Grace is always available for us because grace is contingent on God and not on us. Grace don't depend on what we did today. Grace doesn't depend on the history of our life. Grace doesn't look at our resume and say, okay, we can give a little bit of grace to this person over here, but this person over here gets a whole lot of grace, and that person over there, oh no, they don't get no grace. No, grace is contingent on God, not on us. So when we sin or when we fail, it doesn't put us outside of the reach of God's grace. In fact, when we mess up, it activates God's grace at a new level in our lives. But that don't mean, as Paul says, that since grace abounds and we should keep on sinning, we ought to try to keep it right. We ought to try every day to do what God has called us to do and be who God has called us to be, that we don't abuse the grace that God has given us. But the good news is that we got some grace to fall back on when we mess up. Grace is freely given to us in Jesus, and it can't be taken away when we stumble or fall. When we come to God by faith through the blood of Christ, his grace is ever ready to meet us and to minister to our insufficiencies. Grace is available to us as long as we can admit that we got some insufficiencies. Grace is sufficient for us when we know we're insufficient. Grace expresses God's approval of us. Grace is always available for us. And finally this morning, grace makes God's power accessible to us. My grace is sufficient for you. For my strength or my power is made perfect in weakness. When we read the text, we can tell that Paul is writing this from a reflective point of view. How do we know this? We can see a shift in the demeanor of the text. He says the word therefore twice in the text. The first time he says it is because he recognizes the fact that God is using the thorn and the messenger of Satan to keep him in touch with his limitations and dependent on God. Therefore is a sign of recognition in the text. The second time he says therefore is because that he knows that while he is limited in his own power and strength, God is limitless in the places where he is lacking. God's power is accessible to us when we recognize that God is the limitless one, that we have boundaries, that we are confined by our intellect, by our flesh, by our bodies, by our sinful nature. But when we recognize that we serve a God who has no limit, the God who was and is to come, the God who exists on the outside of time and space, the God who created the world from nothing by speaking it into being, the God that the psalmist wrote about when he said the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. God is limitless. And when we recognize that we are lacking, when we find ourselves dealing with our various thorns in our lives, we can get access to that limitless power that God has, so that the power of the thorn doesn't cause us to put ourselves in even worse positions or predicaments. Notice how Paul rather talks about whatever his issue is in the text. He says in the text, I was given a thorn in the flesh. Remember, he's writing this looking back on it. He's looking back on the fact that he was given. Now, if you in the moment, you probably wouldn't use the word given, because given has a positive connotation, that it was something that you desire. You would probably say something along the lines of this just fell in my lap. This popped up in my life. This just showed up one day, and I wasn't expecting it. But Paul says, I was given. Acknowledging that he receives the thorn and sees the thorn even as a gift, even though he doesn't want it, even though he asks God to take it away. He recognizes that there is some power even in the thorn that he was given, because the thorn connects him to the power that God has to keep him even while the thorn is trying to limit him. He says, I will boast gladly about my weaknesses. Nobody likes to brag about where they fall short. Nobody likes to tell the world about what they have going on that's wrong. But Paul says here, I will boast about my weaknesses. He says, I will delight delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. Nobody takes pleasure in these things. In fact, I would doubt that Paul, he would even take pleasure in these things, except for the fact that if not for these things, he wouldn't have access to the power of God in his life. The issue for Paul is still an issue. The thorn is still there. The messenger from Satan is still tormenting him. But God's grace helps to change his perspective so that he can see the issue differently. That's why Paul says like this at the end of the text. He says, that's why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Interesting, he doesn't say when I am weak, God is strong. He says, when I am weak, I take on the likeness of what God provides for me. And so now, even though I look weak, even though I feel weak, I know that there is strength, because not only am I'm not operating in my own power, but now I'm operating in God's power. And when I'm operating in God's power, I'm stronger than I would ever be operating in my own. And that's the good news in Christmas season. Because when we think about the story of how Jesus arrives on earth, Jesus doesn't arrive coming down from heaven riding a stallion as he's depicted in Revelations. No, Jesus comes as a baby. Jesus comes weak through the womb of a woman. He comes into the world just like you and I came into the world. Some of y'all might have had C-section. I don't know if they had C-section back then, but you was born into the world. And Jesus came weak. Jesus came dependent. He couldn't do nothing for himself when he was a 2-month-old baby. He had to depend on Mary and Joseph to take care of him. Jesus came into the world weak. Why? To show us God's strength in action. And when we think about the fact that Jesus came into the world as a human being, he walked the dusty streets of Palestine. He healed those who were sick. He made the lame to walk, caused the blind to see. When we think about all that Jesus endured and the wisdom that he exuded when sitting with the teachers at 12 years old or challenging the Pharisees during Passion Week, when we think about the weakness that Jesus came with as he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, pleading like Paul was pleading, said, God, if it is possible, take this cup away from me. Jesus came to show us that when we're weak, we can yet be strong, that we can say, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done in my life. And y'all know the ultimate power of what Jesus did. Jesus went to a hill called Calvary. He made himself weak on an old rugged cross, on an unbarked sycamore tree. He made himself weak. In fact, God turned his back on Jesus in that moment for the sins that he was carrying, your sins and my sins. He was so weak that he died on that Friday. They put him in a tomb on that Friday night. He laid there on Saturday. But early on Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hands. Why? Because when he was weak, when he was dead in the grave, God lifted him up by his power. And now that same resurrection power operates in our lives, so that when we're weak, all we got to think about is what God did for Jesus in that tomb on that third day morning in raising him from the dead. We don't have to remain dead to the thorns and the messages. They don't have to control our life, because God has given us the grace that we need to walk in his power, to walk in his strength, to live in his way. And when we don't get it right, God will fill in the gaps for us. God's return policy. I know you hate what you're going through right now. But God's return policy says, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in your weakness. I know it's making you weak right now, but God's grace is sufficient. I know it's hard, but God's grace is sufficient. I know you'd rather live without it, but God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient for you. Word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let's stay all over the building. God's grace is enough for you. Perhaps you're one who came in today.